Speaker of the House Mike Johnson stood at a podium 5 days ago and said something that should be front page news everywhere, word for word. We are not at war. We have no intention of being at war. This is a limited operation. It has a very clear mission, and that mission is nearly accomplished by all estimates. And three of his own party members, three Republicans, just voted in the United States Congress to legally force the president to stop fighting it. Both of those things cannot be true at the same time. Either this is not a war and there is nothing to force the president to stop, or it is a war that three Republicans in the president's own party now believe is unauthorized, unconstitutional, and dangerous enough to stake their political careers on opposing publicly, on the record, with their names attached. Here is what else is true at the same time as Johnson's statement. 8 American soldiers are dead. 140 have been wounded. The conflict has been running for 13 days. Oil is above $100 a barrel. And a CNN poll conducted early in this operation found that 59% of Americans disapprove of the Iran strikes. A majority of the president's own country opposed to a war his speaker just described as not a war. I want to break this down properly, because what happened in Congress this week is not just a procedural vote that failed. It is the first crack in a dam. And the question that every Republican in Washington is now privately asking in offices and hallways and phone calls that are not being recorded is exactly how many more cracks appear before the dam breaks. Here is why this matters today, right now. 3 Republicans broke with the president, not Democrats, not the media, his own party. In a chamber his own party controls. The House vote to constrain Trump's war powers failed 212 to 219, 7 votes. That is the margin between the president's war having congressional cover and it not having congressional cover. 7 votes. In a chamber the Republicans control by a larger margin than that. The Senate measure failed 47 to 53. Rand Paul, a Republican, was the Senate's lone member of the president's party to vote for it. He did not do it quietly. He invoked the 1973 War Powers Act alongside Democrat Tim Kaine of Virginia. He put his name on it, in writing, in the congressional record. 8 soldiers dead. Not metaphorically at war, constitutionally at war. Without a single vote from the branch of government the Constitution assigns that power to. Not incidentally, deliberately. This war does not have a legal authorization. It does not have a declaration. It does not have an authorization for the use of military force. And 3 Republicans just said so on the floor of Congress, in front of cameras, under oath. That is your picture. Let me be precise about what we know and what we do not know, because precision matters more than narrative in a situation this consequential. What we know. On March 4th, 2026, the United States Senate voted 53 to 47 against advancing a war powers resolution that would have halted U.S. military action in Iran and required the president to obtain congressional authorization before re-entering the conflict. Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky was the only Republican to vote in favor of the resolution. Senator John Fetterman of Pennsylvania was the only Democrat to vote against it, joining the Republican majority. This was reported by Reuters, the BBC, the New York Times, and the Associated Press. What we know. On March 5th, 2026, the House of Representatives voted 219 to 212 against a war powers resolution introduced by Republican Thomas Massie of Kentucky and Democrat Ro Khanna of California. 2 Republicans, Massie and Representative Warren Davidson of Ohio, voted to constrain the president. That resolution would have directed the president to, quote, remove United States armed forces from unauthorized hostilities in the Islamic Republic of Iran. These are facts from CBS News, NPR, and the Associated Press. The word unauthorized is not an editorial description. It is the statutory language of the resolution itself. What we know. As of this week, the Trump administration has provided what the New York Times described as varying and at times conflicting explanations for the war, raising what the paper described as questions about its legality. No authorization for use of military force has been requested, introduced, or voted upon. The 1973 War Powers Act, which caps unauthorized military engagements at 60 days, has been invoked by the dissenters as the legal mechanism for their resolution. What we do not know, how many additional Republicans, beyond the three who voted against the president, are currently assessing their own political position and waiting for a trigger event to change their votes. Multiple members are already on record with conditional reservations. What we do not know, whether Trump will seek retroactive congressional authorization before the War Powers Act's 60-day clock expires, or whether he intends to continue the conflict in legal gray territory, relying entirely on executive authority and a compliant Republican majority that is growing measurably less compliant. Here is the promise, word for word. On March 9, 2026, speaking at a Republican policy summit, Donald Trump described the largest American military operation in decades, an operation that has now cost the United States an estimated $3.7 billion in its first 100 hours alone, according to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, in the following terms. Quote, "We took a little excursion to the Middle East to get rid of some evil." A little excursion. Here is what he did 3 days before that statement. On February 28, 2026, Trump authorized Operation Epic Fury, a joint U.S.-Israeli military campaign that struck hundreds of Iranian military installations in the opening hours, killed Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, degraded Iran's air force, navy, radar network, and anti-aircraft systems, and triggered retaliatory Iranian strikes against U.S. military assets across 9 countries. In the first 48 hours, the U.S. military flew over 2,700 sorties and struck more than 250 targets, according to Defense Update. Here is what that did. 8 American service members are dead. 140 have been wounded. The Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's daily oil supply transits, is functionally closed. Oil has crossed $100 a barrel. A CNN poll found that 59% of Americans disapprove of the strikes. And Iran, rather than collapsing under the decapitation strike, has installed a new supreme leader, continued firing missiles and drones, and publicly announced it is, quote, absolutely not seeking a ceasefire. That is the gap between a little excursion and the reality on the ground. Now here is the legal architecture, because this is the piece the cable news coverage is not explaining clearly enough. The War Powers Resolution of 1973 is a federal law passed by Congress in direct response to the undeclared war in Vietnam. Its provisions are specific. The president must consult Congress in every possible instance before committing forces to hostilities. The president must report to Congress within 48 hours of deploying forces if lawmakers have not authorized a declaration of war. And the law caps any unauthorized engagement at 60 days, after which the president must either obtain congressional authorization or withdraw. Trump notified, according to The Guardian, a small group of top lawmakers before the strikes began. He did not seek authorization. He did not obtain it. He has not requested it. What Rand Paul, Thomas Massie, and Warren Davidson did this week was not political theater. They invoked the statutory mechanism of the War Powers Act, the mechanism Congress built specifically for this scenario. A president goes to war. Congress does not authorize it. The law says Congress must vote. These 3 members forced that vote. And the result, the administration winning 219-212 in the House and 53-47 in the Senate, tells you something that the raw vote count obscures. The margins are thin, dangerously thin, for a war the president's own speaker calls not a war. Now understand what this actually means, because the vote is the surface. Underneath it are 3 layers that change the strategic picture entirely. The political meaning is this. Representative Thomas Massie of Kentucky stood on the floor of the United States House of Representatives and said, word for word, they don't want their name associated with this when it doesn't turn out well. But Congress cannot be bothered with its constitutional duty because for many in this chamber, it's easier to simply allow someone else's sons and daughters to be sent to combat without their vote. Read that back. A Republican congressman said that about his own Republican colleagues, not off the record, not in a leaked internal memo, on the floor of the House, on C-SPAN, in the congressional record. Representative Warren Davidson of Ohio added, the moral hazard posed by a government no longer constrained by our Constitution is a grave threat. Unfortunately, Republicans now want to claim they can't answer. What is a war? That is not the language of mild procedural dissent. That is the language of members who believe their party is in the process of making a historic constitutional error, and they are saying so publicly, permanently on the record, in a party where public dissent from the president has historically meant political exile. The military and strategic meaning is this: the three votes are not the story, the conditional votes are the story. Representative Nancy Mace, a South Carolina Republican who voted with Trump this week, went on record beforehand to say, "If this thing goes beyond a few weeks, I'm going to have a lot more concerns. If ground troops get involved, I think that's a very different conversation." Republican Representative Don Bacon of Nebraska, who also voted with Trump, noted that members could always revise our opinions as the conflict develops. These are not endorsements of indefinite war. These are time-limited approvals from members watching a clock, and the clock is running. Phase one of Trump's political strategy was to launch the war and overwhelm Congress with the speed and scale of the opening strikes before opposition could organize. Phase one is complete. Phase two was to win the war powers vote decisively and project unified Republican support for an operation that polling shows is deeply unpopular. Phase two produced a 219-212 House margin and a 53-47 Senate margin. Those are not decisive victories. Those are near defeats. Phase three, which was supposed to be a swift military conclusion that made the political controversy irrelevant, is not happening. The war has entered its second week. Trump told Axios on March 11th that there is practically nothing left to target in Iran, while simultaneously the Pentagon is posting no mercy graphics and declaring they have only just begun to fight. That is not the language of a political strategy in control of its own narrative. That is the language of a coalition that is winning by a margin that is shrinking with every passing day this war continues. And now look at the fracture, because it extends beyond Congress and it is beginning to reach the base. ABC News published a report this week under a headline that should be read carefully. Quote, "Not what we voted for. Some MAGA voices warn Iran backlash will only grow the longer the war lasts." These are not Democrats. These are not mainstream conservatives. These are MAGA movement voices, the political base that delivered Trump his second term, warning that this war is activating a backlash inside the coalition that elected him. Trump ran for president in part on an explicit anti-interventionist message. He spent a decade criticizing the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, the Libya intervention. He called these conflicts disasters. He promised to end the era of American military adventurism. The New Republic published a headline this week. With the war in Iran, Trump has launched his own brand of forever war. Here is the arithmetic that Republican leadership is trying not to say out loud. The House War Powers vote failed 219-212. 7 votes. If the war extends significantly beyond a few weeks, if ground troops are ordered, and if Mace, Bacon, and another 5 to 10 members who are already on record with conditional reservations follow Paul, Massey, and Davidson, the math flips. The president does not have an impenetrable Republican wall in Congress. He has a majority of 7 votes over a war that is costing an estimated $1 billion per day, with oil above $100 a barrel, heading into a midterm election year. Every senator who voted with Trump this week is now on the record supporting a war that 59% of their constituents, according to CNN, disapprove of. The Seattle Times editorial board published a piece this week titled, "Republicans in Congress Fail Public by Dodging War Responsibility." That kind of editorial does not appear in a mainstream American newspaper without reflecting a significant shift in public opinion in the states and districts of the Republicans who voted to give the president a blank check. The fracture is real. It is on the record. It is getting wider, and Trump knows it. Before we go any further, stop at the economics of this fracture, and because the economic pressure on the Republican coalition is the accelerant that turns a 7-vote majority into a problem. The war with Iran is reportedly costing the United States $1 billion per day in military operations alone. The Center for Strategic and International Studies calculated $3.7 billion in the first 100 hours. That is almost entirely unbudgeted. Congress has not passed a supplemental appropriations bill to fund it, which means the conversation about paying for this war, a conversation that congressional Republicans have so far avoided, is coming. It is not optional. It is arithmetic. Oil has crossed $100 a barrel. Goldman Sachs warned, cited by multiple financial outlets, that prices could stay elevated above $100 if the Strait of Hormuz disruption continues for 5 or more additional weeks. The AOIA reported that the national average gasoline price rose from $2.98 to $3.20 in 7 days. That is the fastest single-week spike in years. When gas crosses $4 a gallon, that is not a number on a chart. That is the family in Ohio deciding whether to fill the tank. That is the small business owner in Pennsylvania repricing every delivery. That is the single mother in Nevada choosing between groceries and transportation. And every one of those people is a voter in a midterm election that is fewer than 8 months away. Trump's Republican coalition includes a substantial working-class bloc for whom gas prices are not an abstraction. They are a weekly budget line. Think about that. A war the president called an excursion, costing $1 billion a day, with oil above $100 a barrel, and a 7-vote majority in the House. That combination does not stay stable for very long, but here is the part that makes you smarter than anyone reading the headlines. Here is what is not being covered. Here is the real story underneath the vote count. 3 Republicans broke with Trump this week. That number sounds small. It is not small. It is, in fact, extraordinary. And the reason it is extraordinary requires knowing what happened to the last Republicans who broke with Trump on a war powers vote. In January 2026, 4 Republican senators voted to advance a war powers resolution blocking Trump's military operations in Venezuela. They voted their conscience. They voted with the Constitution. And Trump responded on Truth Social, publicly, immediately, personally. He said those 4 senators should, quote, never be elected to office again. He named them. He targeted them. He made clear that crossing him on a war powers vote carries a specific political price. 2 of those 4 senators reversed their positions afterward. The Venezuela war powers measure failed. Now understand what Rand Paul, Thomas Massie, and Warren Davidson did this week. They voted against Trump on Iran. They did it knowing exactly what Trump does to members who cross him on exactly this issue. They had a documented, recent, specific precedent for the consequences. They voted anyway. That is not a routine procedural difference of opinion. That is a calculated act of deliberate defiance from members who had been shown the cost of defiance and chose to pay it. But here is what that means for the larger picture. If Trump's explicit threat of political retaliation kept 2 of 4 Venezuela dissenters in line, reduced the field of Republican dissenters from 4 to 2 on Venezuela, then what you are seeing on Iran is not the full population of Republicans who want to break. You are seeing the floor, the irreducible minimum, the ones who will not be threatened into silence regardless of the cost. The ceiling of potential Republican dissent is, by the evidence of the conditional statements made this week on the floor of both chambers, significantly higher. Mace said she will have a lot more concerns if the war goes beyond a few weeks. Bacon said members could revise their opinions. An anonymous Republican quoted by ABC News said flatly, "This is not what we voted for. Let that sink in. The dam is not broken." But 3 Republicans just drove cracks into it in public, permanently, on the congressional record. And there are 8 to 12 more standing behind that dam, watching the clock, watching the oil price, watching the body count, with their hands already on the lever. That is your dinner table sentence. Trump called this war a little excursion. 3 of his own Republicans just called it something else, unconstitutional. And the ones who didn't vote against him this week told you exactly what would make them change their minds. He promised this would be a limited operation. He promised it would be over quickly. He called it an excursion. He called the destruction of Iran's military a tremendous success that he could declare complete whenever he chose. He delivered a 13-day war with 8 dead soldiers, 140 wounded, oil above $100 a barrel, and 3 members of his own party voting against him in the branch of government the Constitution says must authorize what he is doing. The gap between those 2 realities, between excursion and unconstitutional hostilities, is the story of this war, and it does not close easily. Trump cannot unpromise a short war. He cannot unspend the $1 billion a day. He cannot unkill the soldiers. He cannot uncross the line that Massey and Davidson and Paul crossed publicly this week, because those votes are in the congressional record now. They do not disappear. They compound. There is no off-ramp visible right now, not because no one is looking for one, but because the conditions that would make an off-ramp politically sustainable, a clear military victory, a credible declaration of success, a unified Republican coalition, are being systematically eroded. Every additional day of war tightens the trap. Every additional death makes the excursion framing harder to sustain. Every additional dollar at the gas pump converts another voter in a swing district from uncertain to opposed. Trump can threaten the three who voted against him. He has done it before, and it has worked before. But you cannot threaten arithmetic, and the arithmetic of a 7-vote House majority in a war with no legal authorization, no clear exit, no unified coalition, and a 59% public disapproval rating is the kind of arithmetic that has ended political majorities before. That is the picture no one else is putting together right now, and now you have it. I will be back the moment something breaks. Share this if it gave you value. This story deserves far more attention than it is getting. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. You saw it first. See you in the next one.